Good morning. My name is Rodger Lewerenz. Welcome to the intermediate EKG class. Today we're going to be talking about cardiovascular anatomy and physiology, 12-lead EKG, talking a little bit about pacemakers and ICDs, and then looking at EKG as it relates to several disease processes, particularly myocardial infarction, heart attack, and other um, diseases. We'll be doing some case studies towards the end. This is about a 6-hour class, so we'll be taking several breaks. Lunch will be at about 11:30. There's a nice break in the material about then, and so it might be a little bit before, a little bit after, but we'll take about a half-hour lunch at that time. As we move through the material, please make sure that you interrupt me, raise your hand, ask questions, and let's have a conversation about the material as we're talking about it. And it'll make it a lot more pertinent rather than asking all your questions at the end. And it'll be a lot more interesting for all of us if it's conversation rather than me just talking at you for 6 hours. So please do interrupt. So some of the things that we're going to be looking at, like I said, are the cardiovascular anatomy and physiology, looking at the EKG components and just a little bit of a refresher on how those measurements are made, the terms that we use around them, identifying some rhythms, and looking at the differences between normal, abnormal, lethal rhythms, and then describing some characteristics for other rhythms, such as some of the junctional rhythms or the ventricular rhythms and heart blocks. Additionally, we'll be looking at MI, heart attacks, and what we're going to see on the EKG when that's happening and how we diagnose those. We're going to be looking at some EKG characteristics for pacemakers, ICDs, and then really digging into what the 12-lead looks like, how it helps us define what's going on in the heart, and getting that 3D model of what's happening electrically via that 12-lead EKG. As we move into this, we really need to have a foundation. We need to have that basic understanding of some terminology. Some of this you'll see used interchangeably in literature, but for our purposes, defibrillation is an unsynchronized countershock. So we hit the button, electricity is delivered to the patient, as opposed to a cardioversion where that's a synchronized countershock. And so that electric impulse will be delivered to the heart in sequence or synchronized with the underlying electrical activity of the heart. And there'll be some instances where we'll want to do that, and we'll talk about that later this afternoon. One of the things to remember when we're talking about cells within the heart is that at rest, they're polarized. They have a negative charge. And when they're depolarized, when they're stimulated, that charge comes back up towards the positive. And so at that point, they're depolarized. After depolarization, they enter a refractory period. And there are two stages of that. There's absolute and relative refractory periods. And again, we'll look at those here in a few moments. It's important to remember, understand that there's two characteristics of the electrical activity and the cardiac mechanical function. So when we have electrical activity, when we see that in an EKG, most of the time it correlates to an underlying mechanical function. We have a pump that goes along with the tracing, but not always. And so just because we have a nice normal looking normal sinus rhythm doesn't always mean that the heart's actually pumping. So we got to look at the patient. The EKG is just one more tool to inform us what's going on with our patient. And remember that one doesn't necessarily mean the other. Most of the time it does. It's pretty unusual to see that lack of mechanical function with a good electrogram or even a bad electrogram, but it can happen. And then when we look at the cells of the heart, those have four main characteristics: automaticity, conductivity, contractility, and excitability. And we'll look into each of those here in a few minutes. So when we look at the anatomy of the heart, just kind of as a refresher, blood returns to the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava, dumps into the right atrium, down into the right ventricle, and then gets pumped out to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. Coming back through the pulmonary veins to the heart, dumps into the left atrium, down into the left ventricle, and then pumps out to the body through the aorta. So when we're looking at the electrical components of the heart, we see that the sinoatrial node, it's a small clump of cells in the high rate atrium that depolarizes at a faster rate than the rest of the heart, or at least it's supposed to. And that's what gives us our innate regular heart rate. And so that impulse spreads to the right atrium, goes over the left atrium, the atria contract, and then that signal comes to the AV node, or the atrioventricular node. And the AV node is a doorway. In a normal heart, it's the only connection, electrical connection, between the atria and the ventricles. And so this protects the ventricles from things like atrial fibrillation and other atrial arrhythmias. Once the electrical stimulus moves through the AV node, moves down through the bundles of His out to the Purkinje fibers, and then the ventricles contract. And so that's one complete heartbeat. So it all comes down to hemodynamics. Perfusion, what's it doing to the body? How is the body responding to this heart rate, these contractions? And so when we're looking at the blood pressure, what we're looking at is cardiac output times systemic vascular resistance. That cardiac output is made up of stroke volume, so the amount of blood ejected by the left ventricle with each beat, times the heart rate. So how fast is that pumping? Systemic vascular resistance then is how big is the tank. And so we make that tank, that vascular system, smaller by giving drugs that contract those vessels, or larger by giving things like nitroglycerin, which dilate. And so blood pressure is stroke volume times heart rate times systemic vascular resistance. Those are the three components. And so anything that we're doing to change our blood pressure is going to affect one of those three things. We're going to be adding fluid, which will affect the stroke volume, one of the things that affects stroke volume. We're going to change heart rate, either speed it up or slow it down. And we're going to be adjusting the systemic vascular resistance, giving medication to dilate or contract those vessels. So fluid in the tank, how fast is the pump pumping, and how big is the tank. All those things affect blood pressure. So when we look at the characteristics of myocardial cells, they have these four main characteristics: automaticity, excitability, conductivity, and contractibility. So automaticity is the ability of these cells to spontaneously generate and discharge an electrical impulse. Any cell in the heart can do this, and normally that function is overridden by an impulse coming from the SA node. However, there are disease processes, electrolyte imbalances, those types of things that would cause a cell other than something in the SA node to start this rhythm, to start that, generate that wave of depolarization. Excitability is the cell's response to that electrical stimulus. So those ions shift across the cell membrane, and the cell responds because of those ion shifts. Contractility is the ability of the cell to contract after receiving a stimulus. So that electrical impulse comes through, those ions shift from intracellular to extracellular and vice versa, and then the cell contracts. That's what gives us our pump. And then conductivity. It's the ability of these cells to transmit that electrical impulse from one cell to the other. So they receive that impulse, they act on it, something happens to them, but then that wave of depolarization, that electrical impulse, gets passed on to the next cell around them. That wave of depolarization is called an action potential. And so it's that rapid depolarization that creates a local area of local area of current, known as the action potential. And so after a patch of this cardiac membrane is depolarized, that electrical charge spreads along the cell surface, opening more channels and propagating that wave of depolarization across the heart, causing the whole thing to contract and pump blood to our body. So there are 5 stages of this action potential. And so the phase 0, which is the rapid depolarization phase. Phase 1, which is early rapid repolarization. And then there's a plateau phase called phase 2. Phase 3 then is the terminal phase, or the ending of that repolarization. And then phase 4 is the resting phase. And this is what that kind of looks like overlaid over a surface ECG. And so the morphology of the action potential that you see in black is one that we would see if we had a catheter inside the heart looking at cells or an area of cells in the ventricle. And then below in blue, we see a surface ECG. So we kind of lay the two over and see how one correlates to the other. When we look at the action potential, you see 0 is that very rapid depolarization. So this wave of depolarization spreads very quickly down through the heart. And then we see this 1, which is that rapid repolarization, going into a bit of a plateau, a bit of a pause. And then we see that downslope of phase 3, where we see the termination of the repolarization going down into phase 4, which is the resting phase. And we see how that's correlated with our QRS complex and T wave. So the propagation of this action potential, so at any point on the cell membrane, can act as a stimulus to those adjacent regions on the cell membrane. That's that ability of those cells to pass on that electrical activity, that excitation. And that excitation process, once started, is spread along the length of the cell and then on to the next one. So that, again, that ability to pass that on and propagate that wave of depolarization. And so a stimulus strong enough to cause a cell to reach that threshold and depolarize starts to cascade. And so that wave spreads out from that initial cell to cells around it, and then it just moves across the surface of the heart, causing those cells to depolarize. And it's known as the all or none principle. So we talked a little bit about the refractory periods. And so immediately after depolarization, we're going to see this short period of absolute refractoriness. So the absolute refractoriness of a cell is immediately after depolarization, when it's in that immediate repolarization phase. And so we can hit those cells with another stimulus, nothing's going to happen, no matter how strong that impulse is. However, in the relative refractory period, some of the cells are starting to get close enough to repolarization that if we hit it with a strong enough impulse, those cells will depolarize. But because some cells are ready, some cells aren't, some cells are kind of there, you're going to get this incomplete, ineffective depolarization. And that's where we get into things like R on T phenomenon that we'll talk a little bit later, where we end up with some ventricular tachycardias that are stimulated by aberrant beats. And then we just talked about this, the relative refractory period. That's that period where the cells are at risk for being depolarized again. So the depolarization rates. The SA node will depolarize inherently at a rate of about 60 to 100, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, depending on our conditioning. But that's that normal heart rate. The AV node will depolarize at a rate of 40 to 60, and then the Purkinje fibers will depolarize at a rate of 20 to 40. And this is our backup system. So if the AV node is sitting there waiting for a wave of depolarization to come down from the SA node, something's wrong with the SA node, there's a block, it just forgets to fire, the AV node will depolarize if that clock has run out. And we're at that 40 to 60 beats per minute range. Similarly with the Purkinje fibers. So they'll sit there, they'll wait for that signal to be coming down from the SA node through the AV node. And if they hit a point in time where they've waited long enough and it's time for them to depolarize that 20 to 40 beats per minute, then they will. So it's that backup system. And that's where we'll see some of those weird beats if we have pauses or delays in transmission of that electrical activity from the SA node to the AV node. So when we're looking at EKGs, it's really important to understand the morphology that we're seeing on the EKG strips, that we understand how those morphologies correlate to cardiac activity, and it's important not to memorize morphologies. We want to assess every one of them, because if we start memorizing morphologies and looking at them quickly, we'll end up in that phase, or that space of, oh, this looks like this, that's what it is. And it gets easy to miss things. So understand, don't memorize. Start slow. This is a long process. You got to look at hundreds to thousands of these over years to really get a real solid understanding. This course is really just an introduction. And then it's incumbent on you to go out there, be looking at EKGs regularly, doing the measurements, doing the interpretations, having somebody check your work, and it's just that building of that process. It takes time, so don't get frustrated early. Be methodical in your approach. Approach a 12 lead, approach an EKG the same way every time, and we'll go through that process this afternoon as far as what do you look for first. But always use that same process. Some of the steps in this process might take you a second and a half. Some of it's pretty quick once you've done enough of them. So this process often doesn't take that long, but making sure you have that process. And then understanding the physiology. When we see those morphologies on the EKG strip, what does that typically correlate to? What do we expect the heart to be doing with those morphologies? What does that look like? How is it affecting the patient?